In our time, the golden word El Dorado has come to mean the goal of unattained desires, the magic country of dreams that forever lies just beyond the horizon. Its literal significance has been lost in the mists of the centuries since when one deluded band of adventurers after another was exploring unknown regions of the New World in quest of the treasure city hidden somewhere in the remote interior of South America. Thousands of lives and millions in wealth were vainly squandered in these pilgrimages, but they left behind them one of the most singularly romantic chapters in the whole history of conquest and discovery. The legend of El Dorado was at first inspired by the tales of a wonderful and veritable Dorado, or Gilded man, king of a tribe of Indians dwelling, at the time of the Spanish conquest, upon the lofty tableland of Bogotá, in what is now the Republic of Colombia. Later investigations have accepted it as true that such a personage existed and that the ceremonies concerning which reports were current early in the 16th century took place at the sacred lake of Guatavita. There lived on this plateau, in what is still known as the province of Cundinamarca, small village communities of the Muisca aboriginals. They worshipped the sun and moon, performed human sacrifices, and adored striking natural objects, as was the custom in Peru. The numerous lakes of the region were holy places, each regarded as the home of a particular divinity to which gold and emeralds were offered by throwing them into the water. Elsewhere than at Guatavita, jewels and objects wrought of gold have been discovered in the process of draining these little lakes. Guatavita, however, is most famous of all because here originated the story of El Hombre Dorado. This sheet of water is a few miles north of the capital city of Santa Fe de Bogotá, more than 9,000 feet above sea level, in the heart of the Cordilleras. Near the lake is still the village called Guatavita. In 1490 the inhabitants were an independent tribe with a ruling chief. They had among them a legend that the wife of one of the earlier chiefs had thrown herself into the lake in order to escape punishment and that her spirit survived as the goddess of the place. To worship her came the people of other communities of the region, bringing their gold and precious stones to cast into the water, and Guatavita was famed for its religious pilgrimages. Whenever a new chief, or king, of Guatavita was chosen, an imposing ceremonial was observed by way of coronation. All the men marched to the lake in procession, at the head of a great party wailing, the bodies nude and painted with ochre as a sign of deep respect. Behind them were groups richly decorated with gold and emeralds, their heads adorned with feathers, cloaks of jaguar skins hanging from their shoulders. Many uttered joyful cries or blew on trumpets and conch shells. Then came the priests in long black robes decorated with white crosses. At the rear of the procession were the nobles escorting the newly elected chief who rode upon a barrow hung with discs of gold. His naked body was anointed with resinous gums and covered with gold dust so that he shone like a living statue of gold. This was the Gilded man, El Dorado, whose fame traveled to the coast of the Caribbean. At the shore of the lake, he and his escort stepped upon a balsa, or raft made of rushes, and moved slowly out to the middle. There the Gilded one plunged into the deep water and washed off his precious covering, while with shouts and music the assembled throng threw their offerings of gold and jewels into the lake. In the last decade of the 15th century, or while Columbus was making his voyages, the tribe of Guatavita was conquered by a stronger community of the Muisca race, and the new rulers, being of a thriftier mind, made an end of the extravagant ceremony of El Dorado. It is therefore assumed that the Gilded man had ceased to be, full 30 years before the Spaniards first heard of him at the coast. The first attempt to go in search of the Gilded man and his kingdom was made, not by a Spaniard, but by a German, Ambrosius Delfinger, who was in command of a colony of his countrymen settled on the shore of the Gulf of Venezuela, a large tract of that region having been leased by Spain to a German company. He pushed inland to the westward as far as the Rio Magdalena, treated the natives with horrible barbarity, and was driven back after losing most of his men. A few years later, and the legend was magnified into a wondrous description of a golden city. In 1538, there marched from the Atlantic coast, Gonzalo Ximenes de Quesada, surnamed El Conquistador, to find the El Dorado. At the head of 625 foot soldiers and 85 mailed horsemen, he made his perilous way up the Rio Magdalena, through fever-cursed swamps and tribes of hostile natives, enduring hardships almost incredible until at length he came to the lofty plateau of Bogotá, and the former home of the real Gilded man. More than 500 of his men had died on the journey of hunger, illness, and exposure. He found rich cities and great stores of gold and jewels, but failed to discover the El Dorado of his dreams. The command of the Spanish troops was turned over to Hernan Perez de Quesada, the cruel and greedy brother of the leader, who fortified himself at Bogotá and proceeded to rob the Muisca people of the last ounce of gold that could be extorted by means of torture and all manner of unspeakable wickedness. In 1540 he tried to drain the lake of Guatavita, tempted by the stories of the vast treasures of gold and jewels that, for centuries, had been thrown into the water by the worshippers, but he recovered valuables only to the amount of 4,000 ducats. With the conquest of this region was obtained the last great store of gold discovered by the plundering Spaniards in South America. For more than half a century, the mad quest continued, and always there came tragedy and disaster. The German colony of Venezuela was wiped out because of these futile expeditions into the interior. Gonzalo Pizarro, brother of the great Francisco, set out to find the city of legend, and returned after 2 years, in such dreadful plight that the survivors of the party looked more like wild animals than men, so that one could no longer recognize them. Meanwhile the myth had assumed new forms. North of the Amazon the supposed city of El Dorado moved eastward until in Raleigh's time it was situated in Guyana beside Lake Parima. This lake remained on English maps until the explorations of Schomburgk in the 19th century proved that it was nothing more than a pond in a vast swamp. That Sir Walter Raleigh, the finest flower of manhood that blossomed in his age, should have believed these and other wonders does not belittle his fame. He lived and fought and sailed in a world that had not been explored and mapped and charted and photographed and written about until all the romance and mystery were driven out of it. It was reserved for other treasure seekers to attack the sacred lake of Guatavita, and to capitalize the venture as a joint stock company with headquarters in London and a glittering prospectus offering investors an opportunity of obtaining shares in a prospective hoard of gold and jewels worth something like $1 billion. As an engineering problem, draining the lake seemed practicable and comparatively inexpensive. It is a deep, transparent pool, hardly more than 1,000 feet wide, almost circular, and set like a jewel in a cup-like depression near the top of a cone-shaped peak, several hundred feet above the nearby plateau. The tunnel therefore had only to pierce the hillside to enter the lake and let the water flow out to the plain below. It was estimated that the shaft had to be driven a distance of 1,100 feet. No serious obstacles were encountered until the tunnel had tapped the bottom of the lake and the water began to run off through carefully regulated sluices. Then, as the surface lowered, and the submerged mud was exposed to the air, it solidified in a cement-like substance which was almost impossible to penetrate. The treasure must have sunk many feet deep in this mud during 4 or 5 centuries, and the workmen found it so baffling that operations were suspended. The promoters of the enterprise found this unexpected obstacle so much more than they had bargained for that they had to abandon it for lack of resources. In their turn they had been thwarted by the spirit of the Gilded man, and the treasure of El Dorado is still beyond the grasp of its eager pursuers.